Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. How many of you are in a narcissistic relationship where basically the entire relationship consists you of merely tolerating the other person? Well, let's talk about that as we keep talking about the different types of narcissistic relationships. And those of you who don't know this channel, I hope you do. This is a YouTube channel on narcissism. And if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button. Okay, so this series is on different kinds of narcissistic relationships and how subtly different they can be. Now, we know this. Not everyone can leave a narcissistic relationship. Money, children, culture, you know the drill, right? So people stay. Not everyone who is in one of these tolerator relationships actually understands narcissism. Sometimes the person doesn't have any clue with what narcissism is, but still creates a tolerator relationship. And I sometimes wonder if the people in this situation may not have ever learned what narcissism is, and if you're on this channel, you better, but they finally understood that nothing they do is making this relationship better. They can't or won't get out, so they just tolerate it. And that's what a tolerator relationship is. You just tolerate what's happening in this relationship. Some tolerator relationships are a throwback to generations past when divorce was very stigmatized, so people stuck it out in awful marriages with narcissistic folks. They would just tolerate the unempathic, invalidating, dismissive, manipulative, dreadful behavior and slowly sort of lose themselves. This sort of group of people who's had their life force sucked out of them by their narcissistic relationships in some ways can almost look like the women patients Freud worked with and wrote about, or even sort of the hollowed out housewives of the 1950s we know about. The tolerating in these relationships came out of not having any options. It may not have been a good thing, and these were often long-suffering folks in these relationships who just sort of over time learned to become numb, helpless, and almost dissociated from what the other person in the relationship was doing. I have witnessed it with folks I know and have worked with, and it is not pretty. Tolerating in a tolerator relationship is not what happens when you engage in a radical acceptance, because tolerance, when you're in a tolerating relationship, there's a sort of passivity you have in these relationships. People who radically accept, that's not a passive process. It's an active process characterized by awareness that permeates you. It's an active disengagement. It's a concerted effort to break out of self-blame cycles by knowing that this person will never change and then to embrace self-compassion, right? People within family systems have these sorts of tolerating relationships as well. Sometimes because they may not need to see the family members as often, so they may be able to tolerate for short sprints and then sort of live their lives away from the family member more often than not. But the longer and more extended the contact with the family members whom you think you have a tolerating relationship with, the more of a toll it takes. Now, sadly, in some ways, the tolerators need to be almost a little enably to stay in the relationship, because even as other people may be noticing that your relationship is terrible, or you even notice that you don't like how the narcissistic person is treating you, the person in a tolerator relationship may find themselves making excuses or just sort of anemically saying, what can I do? It's who they are. I get it, because the tolerators are in a terrible situation that they're trying to endure, and then they don't have an easy way out. Tolerating relationships can be observed not only in close relationships or marriages, but also in adult children of narcissists and family members and in colleagues. There is still so often so little recourse against toxic colleagues. So people may feel as though they just have to put up and may just spend their time drawing angry doodles during soul-sucking meetings. Maybe that's just me. And they tolerate because you recognize that given the limitations of the workplace, you sure as hell aren't going to be able to do much other than either quit the job or hope that the narcissistic person quits first. So you tolerate. I actually think that a really large proportion of narcissistic relationships are tolerating relationships. There isn't much to be done. They won't change. We can't always get out of them. And in some cases, there are lower impact narcissistic relationships we have in our lives where we just tolerate because the contact isn't often enough to make that big a change around it. But there can be such regret in the tolerating relationships. To be in a tolerating relationship can really bring up grief with the idea of, is this as good as it gets? Or is this all that life is? The only offset to being in a tolerating narcissistic relationship is to have other parts of your life that are more empathic and compassionate and loving and kind. Those spaces become places of rejuvenation. The tolerating narcissistic relationship, in some ways, is what we have become socialized to do: put up and shut up. If you are in a tolerating narcissistic relationship, please get out there and find other spaces, callings, interests, anything to be an offset to this empty relational space. I know that one of the great challenges of narcissistic abuse is how many people are stuck. The tolerators can tolerate, but have to remember to not self-blame, to learn to disengage, to not enable, and find ways to bring some color and richness into their lives without the narcissist. I do sometimes wonder if most of us don't have at least one tolerator relationship, and the problem is these do take a toll on you. So just as a recap, the tolerator relationship is that relationship where you just sort of kind of put up with it. You don't try to change it. You don't really engage that much. You sometimes make excuses for it, but you just tolerate it. You certainly don't, I mean, again, in a way you might be thinking, what's the difference between this and radical acceptance? The tolerators are feel a bit more passive and helpless, as though this is my fate, this is my life. The radical acceptors are like, yeah, this isn't going to change, so I'm going to actually take some real action in my life in other places, recognizing that this person's never going to come around. In some ways, the tolerators, it's not that they're waiting for the narcissist to come around, but it's rather that the tolerator is almost like sort of like I can only liken them to like a person marching like a soldier with their head down and just sort of trying to push themselves through the days and just enduring this thing that they're in, but not trying to make it better in any way. So that's what those tolerator relationships are. Like I said, I can't think of a person out there who has some narcissists in their life where this pattern doesn't characterize at least one of those relationships. Thanks again.